Hey there, everyone. Welcome back for another deep dive. Uh, you guys sent in a ton of articles on Hurricane Helene, so let's get right into it. Looks like we're focusing on the aftermath.
Yeah, and it's a pretty impressive collection you've got here. We've got pieces from like right after Helene made landfall, all the way to stuff coming out of CNN just an hour ago.
It's amazing to see how the story unfolds as more information comes
Yeah.
out. So to set the stage, we know Helene hit Florida's Big Bend as a Category 4. I mean, that's already huge, right? Historic for that region.
Vastly historic. And we're seeing the impact isn't limited to just Florida either. There are reports here covering flooding all the way up in North Carolina, tornado warnings near Atlanta. It's a good reminder that a hurricane's reach goes way beyond its landfall point.
It really does. I have to admit, I was surprised to see just how widespread the effects are. But okay, there's one thing in here I've got to ask you about because it stopped me in my tracks. There's this video clip from Tampa Bay, this guy Matt Heller, and he is paddling a kayak. But get this, he's inside his house.
Wait, inside, like through his living room or something?
Exactly. He's making his way through his flooded house in a kayak.
Wow. Okay, that's something else. You know, it's funny because you see those Florida man headlines all the time, but this is what we're talking about.
Right. It's almost comical until you remember this is someone's actual reality during a hurricane.
Exactly. And I think that clip speaks to a really important point about hurricane preparedness. You know, we always talk about having a plan, but how many people are truly ready for the unexpected?
It's so true. And speaking of preparedness, it's interesting because we have these contrasting experiences playing out. On the one hand, you've got Matt Heller dealing with this sudden, unexpected flooding. And then on the other, we have Jules Carl and her baby Kai.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading about her. What's the latest with them?
Well, the article about Jules mentions that she was actually pregnant with Kai during Hurricane Idalia last year.
Wow. So they're facing down another major hurricane just a year later.
Hmm.
And if I remember right, Idalia hit Steinhatchee really hard.
Yeah, it did. And sadly, it looks like Steinhatchee's facing another round of major damage and flooding with Helene. It makes you think about the toll these storms take, not just physically, but emotionally and economically, too.
It's true. We often focus on the immediate aftermath, the damage, the flooding, but those longer term impacts, the emotional toll, the financial strain, those are things we need to be paying attention to as well.
I agree. And speaking of things we need to pay attention to, you are not going to believe this. One of the articles talks about how officials in Taylor County are advising residents who didn't evacuate to write their name and birth date on their leg in permanent marker.
Hold on, what? Are you serious? In permanent marker on their leg.
Yep, that's what it says. Apparently, it's for identification purposes in case of a worst-case scenario with the storm surge.
Wow, that is
Yeah.
sobering, to say the least. It really underscores the potential severity of this storm surge.
It does. So we've got the very real potential for widespread devastation. But then, and I know it's going to sound a little strange, but stick with me here. There's an article about the Waffle House Index.
The Waffle House Index. Oh, yeah, I've heard of that.
Uh,
Isn't that the thing where if a Waffle House is closed after a hurricane, it means things are really bad?
exactly. It seems kind of funny at first, but FEMA actually uses it, unofficially at least, to get a sense of how bad a disaster is.
Well, it makes sense when you think about it. Waffle House is famous for being open 24/7.
Yeah.
If they're closed, it's serious.
Right. It's like this weird but surprisingly accurate barometer for how bad things are after a hurricane.
And it speaks to something else, too, that idea of community resilience that we were talking about earlier. Waffle House is often one of the first businesses to reopen after a disaster, and that can be a huge morale boost for people.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought about it like that. It's not just about getting a waffle, it's about that sense of normalcy returning. Yeah.
Exactly. And that sense of normalcy, that feeling that things are starting to get back on track, that's a crucial part of the recovery process.
You know, it's incredible to think about how one storm can have such a ripple effect. I mean, we're talking about a hurricane that hit Florida,
Mm-hmm.
but the impacts are being felt way beyond the coast.
Absolutely. And it really highlights how interconnected everything is. The power outages are a prime example.
Oh man, don't even get me started on those. Reading about people in the dark trying to stay cool with no AC makes you realize how much we take electricity for granted.
Right. And it's not just about comfort either. We've got hospitals running on generators, businesses having to close their doors, supply chains getting disrupted. One of these articles even mentioned something called cascading failures, where a problem in one part of the infrastructure can trigger a whole chain reaction of problems.
It's like a domino effect.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's a little unnerving to think about. And it's easy to forget about the economic side of things too. All those businesses that are closed, all the damage that needs to be repaired.
It's going to be a long road to recovery for a lot of people. That's for sure. And then there's the whole issue of insurance.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Insurance companies are going to have a field day with this one.
Well, not exactly. I mean, a lot of companies are already struggling in Florida. Premiums are going up, deductibles are getting higher, and some people are even having trouble getting their claims paid at all.
It's almost like a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
You live in a hurricane-prone area, so you need insurance, but then the insurance companies are overwhelmed with claims after every storm.
Exactly. It's a really complex problem with no easy solutions, and it makes you wonder about the bigger picture, the long-term sustainability of living in these areas.
That's a whole other conversation.
Oh.
But, in the midst of all this doom and gloom, it's important to remember the human side of things. Remember Jules Carl, the mom who rode out Adelia while she was pregnant?
Of course. How could I forget?
Well, there's another story here that really resonated with me. It's about this 18-year-old student, Anastasia Russell. She's riding out Helene at Florida State University in Tallahassee.
Oh, wow. So she's basically stuck on campus. What's she doing to cope with the storm?
Well, according to the article, she's holed up in one of the conference centers that's been reinforced for extreme weather. They've got a bunch of students there, and they're just trying to make the best of it.
Playing games, watching movies, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Just goes to show you the resilience of people, even in the face of these really intense situations. But, reading about Anastasia's experience got me thinking about something else.
Was that?
Well, it seems like more and more we're seeing universities having to step up and provide shelter during these extreme weather events.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're becoming de facto evacuation centers.
You're right. I hadn't really thought about it that way, but it makes sense. I mean, they've got the infrastructure, the space, and in a lot of cases, they're already equipped to handle large numbers of people.
Exactly. It's just another example of how these storms are forcing us to adapt and rethink the way we do things. But speaking of adapting, one of the articles had a really simple but helpful tip from a CNN meteorologist, Chad Myers.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
He suggested freezing bottles of water to help keep your fridge colder if the power goes out. Seems obvious now that I think about it, but I'd never actually considered doing that before.
That's a good one. I'm always amazed at how much food people end up having to throw away after a storm because their fridge warmed up.
Right. And then there's always that awkward moment when you're trying to decide if the milk is still good or not.
Yeah, exactly. I think my record is like 3 days without power. I was really pushing it with that milk.
Oh, no. I've been there. It's funny how those little things, the milk going bad, the fridge not working, those are the things that can really start to wear on you during a power outage.
Absolutely. It's the little inconveniences that add up and start to make things feel really stressful, which is why those practical tips like freezing water bottles, they might seem small, but they can make a big difference in helping you feel more prepared and in control.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's like we were talking about earlier with the unexpected damage. It's often the things you don't think about that end up causing the most trouble.
Exactly. Like that point Chad Myers made about reinforcing your garage door. It seems like a small detail, but apparently a weak garage door can be the first thing to go in a storm, and that can lead to all sorts of other problems.
Exactly. It's those hidden vulnerabilities that can really trip you up.
Yeah.
So I guess the takeaway here is that preparedness isn't just about having enough supplies. It's also about really understanding the potential weak points in your home and taking steps to address them. I mean, we've covered so much ground here. It's amazing how much there is to unpack with just one hurricane.
Yeah. You start out thinking it's all about wind and rain, but then you get into the infrastructure problems, the economic fallout, the psychological impacts.
It really makes you realize that hurricanes are about so much more than just the weather.
They're about people and communities and how we adapt and recover in the face of these increasingly intense events.
And speaking of adapting, we've talked about a lot of different aspects of preparedness today, from the practical tips like freezing water bottles to the bigger picture stuff like understanding your insurance policy.
It's all connected, right? Being prepared for a hurricane means thinking about all the different ways it can impact your life and taking steps to mitigate those risks.
Absolutely. Well said. So as we wrap up our deep dive on Hurricane Helene, what's the one big takeaway you hope listeners walk away with?
I think for me, the biggest takeaway is the importance of community, that sense of coming together to support each other in the face of adversity. It's something we've seen time and time again with these storms.
It's that old saying, it takes a village, right?
Exactly. And not just to rebuild, but to prepare as well, because the reality is that as these storms become more frequent and more intense, we're all going to need to rely on each other more and more.
So true. Well, folks, there you have it. Hurricane Helene. A stark reminder of the power of nature and the resilience of the human spirit.
And a call to action, too, I think. A reminder that we all have a role to play in preparing for and responding to these kinds of events.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for diving in with us today, everyone. And to all those affected by Helene, stay safe out there.